Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's a couple of minutes after 12:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's professional development webinar presented by Career Services with the CUNY School of Professional Studies. Today's topic is Refresh Your Resume. My name is Shannon Gallo. I am the manager of career services here at CUNY SPS, and I am delighted to be joined by my colleague, Clark Griffith.
Hey, everyone.
Hello, Clark. Welcome.
Thank you,
Clark,
Shannon.
Clark is a program director here with the CUNY SPS Professional Education and Workplace Learning Group, PULE. He oversees the NYC Opportunity Program Management Forum and also does a lot of work with the Central Park Conservancy Institute for Urban Parks program. So I'm thrilled to have Clark joining us today. I think he's going to have a lot of worthwhile ideas and suggestions for our attendees this afternoon. So moving into our agenda, first is this little introduction that I'm doing right now. Another shout out and mention I will give is to Nikita Cassidy. She is the data coordinator for the career services team at CUNY SPS. And without Nikita's expertise and support, a lot of our webinars and programs would not be possible. So thank you, Nikita. She's going to be monitoring our chat and helping with tech support during today's session. We are offering a live stream of captions for the event. You can access those either via Zoom itself or stream text. And there should be a link that Nikita has shared with you in the chat. Other than the housekeeping items, we'll focus mostly on resumes, a little bit on other job search toolkit documents, a little bit on employment applications, on online applications, and finally we'll close out with Clark's live resume critiques. So I'd like to thank two of our attendees who have volunteered to have their resumes reviewed live on today's webinar. And last but not least, we'll take some questions. If you do have questions that arise, feel free to send them in the chat during our presentation, and we'll do our best to get to those at the end. So I will move into our content. So when we talk about resumes, whether one is creating a resume from the beginning, from scratch, or they're making updates and changes for a resume, there are typically two types of formats that are mostly used. The first of those is a reverse chronological format. And this is traditionally what you think of when you think of resume formats. This is the format which involves your experience listed in order from most recent to least recent. You would always have your current position on top. This type of resume is more focused on job titles and organizations where you are working. And it really does a nice job of highlighting your career or educational progression, loyalty to certain employers, and also it does a great job of really highlighting and emphasizing your most recent achievements. Another somewhat popular format for resumes is functional. And this is really, as the word itself describes, a focus on qualifications, the competencies and achievements that one has. This resume can be useful for career changers, sometimes someone who is very entry level, or even for someone re-entering the workforce after an absence. This type of format, the functional format, highlights more so your professional skills, your intangible skills, and I'll say your transferable skills. And this type of resume format, as I said before, is useful for career changers. And I think this is really where you have the opportunity to highlight your transferable skills. And even if the resume does not necessarily focus on experience directly related for the job you're applying to, if you use a functional format for your resume, that can really help an employer understand why you're still a strong candidate for those positions. Lastly, I will mention that at times, there can be a resume that sort of uses both formats. It can have mostly a functional setup, but also lists job titles and organizations with dates to still show your progression within your career, but has more of a focus on the functions. Another important thing to keep in mind, whether you're refreshing the resume or starting from scratch, building a new one, is that it's suggested to not use a template. Now, years ago, this was even more difficult than it is now. But what happens in templates is, even if your resume is already in a template, it's very difficult to make changes to the document. So I suggest starting from scratch, open up Microsoft Word and include your content with no formatting. And then once you've got the content firmed up in the resume, go through and make the changes to it. This is where I suggest using a font that's the same throughout the document. A simple font tends to work best. And this is for the human eye as well as the artificial one. In terms of a simple font, Times New Roman, Arial, Verdana, Tahoma are just 4 of the fonts that typically work best. Black only is suggested in nearly all situations. And as I mentioned before, if you start from scratch, you have the content in the resume, that's where you can go through and use bold, italics, underlining for emphasis. And this is, if you look at a resume template, that's ultimately what they're doing. But because they are very restrictive in making changes, I find that it's easier to update a resume when you've created it from the beginning yourself. Other things to keep in mind with resumes, consistency is very important. The document should be a clean, crisp, consistent document throughout. So this means the margins should be aligned. This means that each subheading or title or location or date should be done in the same way. If you list your jobs with the job title on one line and then tab over and have the dates, the next line could be your employer, and then tab over and align the location with the dates for each position. Typically, no graphics or photos should be used on resumes. An exception does apply in some cases for European documents, but for the most part, photos are not suggested to be used on resumes. Graphics should be kept to a minimum. Exceptions, again, maybe if you work in a very, very creative field, some graphics may be okay on the resume, but certainly not to the extent that they are distracting from the content. Lastly, I always suggest using bullets. This can really keep the resume neat and easy for someone to read quickly. And later, when Clark goes through and does a review of some live resumes, I think when we bring the resumes on the screen, if we think back to these kinds of comments, you'll understand why it's so important that the resume is so consistent and crisp and clean throughout. So talking a little bit about content on the resume, which is probably just as important as format. I will talk a little bit about verb tenses and variety of word choice. I'll talk about the connotation and quantity in a resume, achievement and results-oriented resumes. Finally, I'll give you some ideas and pointers about a summary statement and talk a little bit about using buzzwords, keywords, some might call them. And finally, I'll give you some pointers about the overall impression of your resume document. So verbs, a super important part of your resume content. Your current job should be present tense, your previous jobs past tense. So after today's webinar, I will send a number of sample documents out to everyone. And I think that that can be helpful when you're coming up with your own resume updates. But the important thing to keep in mind is that current, present, previous, past. I mentioned bullets before. It's important to make sure that when you are using bullets, that each one begins with the strongest action verb. It's also important to avoid repeating certain words. I think when someone is looking at, a stack of resumes and they're going through and they see the word assist over and over and over, multiple times in a row on a resume, they tend to lose interest, and it provides, with the short amount of time that a person may spend looking at the resume, it's important to provide that variety. The same thing is true with different phrases or sentences. If you've had two similar positions and you've done similar work in each position, think about that when you're crafting your resume, and make sure that you're not necessarily repeating things in each and every job. There certainly should be some differences in the work that you've done, and this is where you can use the content to really describe that variety of experience. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that when you're thinking about word choice and using descriptive words, make sure that you're honest, that you don't overdo it and embellish and get yourself into a position or job that you're not actually qualified for. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're descriptive and providing a nice variety of descriptions.
And Shannon, I just wanted to weigh in on the word assist. The word assist. When I hear the word assist, I think of, you have you're contributing to a project or a task, but you didn't have full ownership. So I think assist is okay, but I would think about words that are strong to Shannon's point, but also that kind of show that it was your work. Some words that I jotted down are spearheaded, initiated, implemented, attained. Really strong words that kind of show that you had responsibility for accomplishing whatever you had achieved.
Great point. And that leads right into this next part of the discussion on word choice and thinking about using positive phrases and words that evoke a more favorable impression. An example of this might be that I see on resumes a lot of times people say, dealt with angry customers. Maybe a more positive way to describe that part of your job could be thinking of solutions or suggesting solutions. Rather than saying dealing with angry customers, you could say providing solutions to customer support. And I think saying providing solutions instead of saying dealing with angry customers creates a more favorable outlook and impression. I also always mention that adding numbers, percentages, any kind of quantifiable details can go a long way to add credibility. This is where you can really show the impact that you've made. As Clark said, using those strong words can really make a difference. And I think that even if you're in an entry-level position, maybe you, again, using the customer service example, if you're in a call center and you're handling 200 to 300 calls per day, that's a significant amount of work production when someone else might also be in a similar customer service role, but they're only managing 20 or 30 calls a day. So it's important to provide those quantities to really give the employer the idea of the impact and the scope of your work. Again, achievements and results are important. And this is where you really want to think about how you can add little things outside of your job description. What are projects that you have maybe managed, maybe ideas or solutions that you have contributed in your organization? And how did those things make a difference? This can be you figured out a way to save money. Maybe you identified a new vendor that your organization could contract with that offered better pricing. Maybe you found a new way to go through a tedious process in your organization and you increased efficiency. Maybe you saved your boss some time. These are the kinds of things that you want to make sure you include in your resume, even if they're sort of outside of your customary job duties. This is also where you want to make sure that you include things, even if your title doesn't indicate them, that are related to managerial or leadership functions. And some examples of this, maybe you have been working in a retail setting and you're a senior member of your team and your supervisors have frequently asked you to train new employees, or they've asked you to participate in hiring and recruiting new employees. These things may not appear in your title or in your job description, but it's very important to list them on your resume. Another important thing to keep in mind is that if you've had an expanded role or you've been promoted, even if it's within the same organization, it's important to list that explicitly on the resume. A couple of comments about a summary on a resume. And this is something, thinking back to the two formats of your resume, I think especially on a functional resume, a summary can be very useful to really articulate to your prospective employers the experiences that you have, the transferable skill sets that you have, and how all of those things make you qualified for the position. This can also be seen as your pitch. If you've attended some of our previous webinars, we do a lot of talking about personal branding and being able to pitch yourself. And the summary can really sort of be and act as your personal pitch on your resume. It can be an overview of the qualifications you said. And as I described before, you can also specifically state what you're looking for, especially if maybe you've decided to pursue a degree that's unrelated to your previous experience. You can list that you're pursuing that degree with the intention of making a career transition. Lastly, the summary can be a great place to incorporate keywords, also known as buzzwords. And this is where you can make sure that what you're talking about on your resume aligns with what the employers are talking about in their job specs. Make sure that they're industry specific. Again, like I said, take your cues from the job postings. Make sure that when you are listing skill sets or buzzwords, that they're relevant and current. You may have experience from a number of years ago in certain programs that are not so commonly used, that are obsolete. Make sure that those types of things come off of the resume. Even if you have those skill sets, it's important to make sure that you're showing the current skills and competencies that you have, most importantly. Lastly, I'll mention be careful with acronyms. And this is especially true if you work in the public sector, if you work for CUNY. There are tons and tons of acronyms that float around the university setting or the public sector that would not be familiar to someone outside of your organization or industry. Also be careful if you're describing, I always mention this as an example for our health professionals. If you include knowledge of HIPAA, it's not HIPPA, it's HIPAA, and those kinds of things can also be a red flag for a potential employer. If you've, not exactly communicated the acronym correctly, that can be a challenge as well. As I move into the final section on resumes specifically, I did just want to remind everyone that if you have questions that come up, Clark and I will do our best to address them at the end. You can feel free, however, to send them in chat, and then Nikita will be able to help us moderate through the questions at the end. So before I move on, a couple of notes about the overall impression of the document. And these are some of the pointers, really as far as the overall impression. When I worked a number of years ago in staffing and recruiting, these are some of the things that we used to do as recruiters when we were looking at resumes. One thing that was important, especially with a reverse chronological resume, is to read it from bottom to top. The idea being that your experience on the bottom, your least recent experience, will get progressively more responsible. You'll have progressively more responsibilities as you read up the resume. And it also will have the most relevant and current skill sets and experiences at the top. I also suggest going over the document out loud. Sometimes just reading a document aloud, either to yourself or to a friend or colleague, can really help you understand how it flows to the reader. Sometimes words just mechanically sound a little awkward, and it's hard to understand that unless you're reading it out loud. Finally, I also suggest that printing out the document for a review can also be helpful. That just gives you an overall impression. If there's anything on the document that seems distracting to the reader, if there are any margins that are not exactly aligned, sometimes you can get a better perspective on those kinds of small details if you've printed the document out. I always suggest that while you construct and update the resume in Microsoft Word, make sure that along with the version in Microsoft Word, you also have it saved as a PDF file. And that is what you use for the most part if you're emailing the document or submitting the document. With the prevalence of tablets, phones, PCs, laptops, all different types of operating systems and applications and other things like that, typically a PDF format will be a lot less likely to get thrown off with the format, no matter what kind of device the person is using. Again, as I mentioned before, no photos should be included on the document. And lastly, I mentioned customization. And this is where, especially if you are submitting the document at a job fair or on an applicant tracking system where there may not necessarily be a cover letter to accompany the resume, you can take some time to do some small customizations on the document, as I had said before, with the keywords and those types of things. And that can really make a difference in setting you apart from other candidates. Clark, any final pointers on the overall impression of resumes before I move on?
What I say is put yourself in the position of somebody who is looking at a lot of resumes. And I've been in that position, and, it's so easy to submit an online resume, and you can get hundreds. And think about what it's like for that person. So all of the tips that Shannon is sharing, one thing that's helpful to me when I'm interviewing is looking at resumes is 2 pages is sufficient. Keep it to 2 pages. I've had sometimes received resumes that were 8 pages, and it's just, I don't have the time to go through all of that. And making sure that there's breathing room. Shannon talked about the font size. Make it easy and scannable for somebody to read, and particularly on that first page to really get your most important accomplishments and skills, so that they really get a sense of your strengths.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's a question that comes up a lot. Is it okay for a resume to be longer than 1 page? And I typically answer yes, but probably not okay for the resume to be 3 pages, 4 pages, 7 or 8 pages. And that's a good point. Thank you, Clark. So I'll take just a couple of minutes to talk about some other job search toolkit related documents. The first of those is your references sheet. And this is something for for years, it was advised to put a little line on the bottom of your resume that said, references provided upon request. And yes, that is certainly true, but it is no longer suggested to even use a line on your resume to put that statement. Instead, just have a prepared references sheet, something separate from the resume. I would suggest using the same heading for branding purposes. It's typically suggested that you have 3 professional individuals who can reference you. Certainly from the workplace is preferable and important. If it's a direct supervisor, a close colleague, a vendor, a client, those kinds of people can be professional references. Also, faculty certainly can be useful, particularly if you were applying for graduate school or other academically focused types of roles. The other thing about a references page is that it's something that we recommend you have available. You make sure that your references know that you are including them and that their contact information is accurate. But you hold on to that, and only when the employer requests your references contact information do you share it. It also can be very useful when you are filling out online applications, because that's a good way to make sure you're putting accurate information into those databases. So that's why I always suggest just preparing your references sheet and preparing your references themselves when you're putting together your resume and other documents. Cover letters. This is a big one, a very important one, I might add. It's interesting, and I think that if you put a bunch of hiring managers and recruiters and career coaches and experts in a room together, you would probably get, if you had 50 of those people, you would probably have 50 different ideas and opinions on cover letters. But the advice I am sharing today is, really based on what I hear most frequently, that cover letters are extremely important, and they can certainly make or break your chances for an interview. Now, when you are doing a cover letter, it is important to take the time to do them well. The cover letters that tend to work best are targeted and specific. So again, certainly not using a form template. Many times a cover letter might come through and it'll pretty much be the same thing for every job the person applies to, with the exception of a different job title and a different company name at the beginning. And when I'm talking about targeted and specific cover letters, I'm talking about going beyond that. This is where you really have the opportunity to show your personality and explain what you're passionate about. What makes you tick? Why are you interested in this organization? What is it about this job that appeals to you? Cover letters really give you a chance to prove you're a serious candidate. And those kinds of things are just not going to come across through your resume. You could work for hours on your resume and have a fabulous resume document put together, but it's just not going to give you the same opportunity to really articulate to that employer your interests. They are a lot of work, and they take a lot of time to really be thoughtful and specific about. But something that I think is an added bonus about cover letters is if you do get a call back and you're asked to interview for the position, you've already done your homework. You've already really been thoughtful about that job. You've looked through to figure out the things that you offer to that employer in the position. And it's really, I think, a nice way to have already got you started on your interview preparation if you do take the time to do those cover letters. Now, as you do them, more and more of them, you will find that some cover letters can sometimes be interchangeable with employers and organizations. But for the most part, it's really important to be thoughtful and take your time to really make them unique. Clark, do you have anything to add as far as cover letters go? I mean, I have a little bit more information that I'll share.
So when we do postings, the instructions are to please upload a resume and a cover letter. If someone submits a resume and no cover letter, I don't look at it, because it means that the applicant didn't follow the instructions. And that's a concern for me right off the bat. The other thing is, to me, it's a work product. It's a work sample. It's a writing sample. So I get to see your eye for detail. I get to see your writing style. As Shannon said, it's really an opportunity for your unique personality and skills, and why you are passionate about this job and you feel you're a good fit. It's really an opportunity for all of those things to come through. So I think they're very important, and it is an opportunity to look at the job posting and use some of the words from the job posting. I can tell right away if the cover letter is just the generic cover letter that's used for everybody, and I can tell when it's been tailored for the job that they're applying for with us. So I think they can really help differentiate you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, as I said before, this is where you have the opportunity to show that you have enthusiasm for the position. The other thing, just as I mentioned with resumes, including keywords is very important. An example of this, is depending on industry, if the job description in that particular industry uses the term client, but your resume uses the term customer, sometimes something as simple as that can make a big difference in, your resume being read and taken more seriously if you take the time to incorporate those kinds of things into the cover letter. And as Clark mentioned, it's, I think employers are looking for certain things in cover letters, and they're able to easily tell who has taken the time to work on it. Particularly, it is, it's just an extension of yourself. And sometimes I look at, you sort of have your cover letter as the advertisement for your resume, and your resume is the advertisement for your interview. So, those are important things to keep in mind as you submit applications and as you think about the way you qualify for positions. Another important piece of your job searching toolkit are follow-up thank you letters. Are they necessary? Absolutely, all the time. Even if the position turns out to not be something you're interested in, even if you don't think that the company is going to be for you, or whatever reason you don't think that the position is going to work out, it's still crucial to follow up with the person. You just never know how things can change. Sometimes if a position isn't ideal for you, and this is something that comes out in the interview, the person you're interviewing with may have, a colleague down the hall on another team who's looking for someone, and they run into each other in the hallway later that day, and the person says, oh, I just realized a person I met with, they weren't the right fit for my position, but they would be great for your team. And if you've taken the time to follow up with that person and really start to build rapport and a relationship with them, it can really benefit you in the long run. Typically, when you're putting together a follow-up thank you letter, email is best. It works much more quickly, obviously. It's certainly more reliable than postal mail. It also, especially with so many organizations and people working remotely or in hybrid settings, it's just too difficult to know exactly where a person would physically be located. So certainly email works best. A general rule of thumb for the length and content on a follow-up thank you letter is, I think it should align with the length and content of the interview itself. If it was a brief 15-minute phone conversation with a resume screener, the follow-up thank you letter may not be as lengthy or technically heavy as it would be if you're meeting with the hiring manager and their director for an hour and a half. I think that that's a good sort of general rule of thumb to follow. Follow-up thank you letters can also be a way to help stay top of mind to the employer, particularly if they have a schedule of interviews they're following. It also is a way to remind them of things you talked about in your conversation. And lastly, this can be your close. When you've spoken to someone in an interview and they have said to you, we'll be making a decision a week from now, you'll hear from us. You can reiterate in your cover letter, I look forward to hearing from you within a week, and reiterate your interest, let them know how enthusiastic you remain about the position. And hopefully those kinds of things will help them remember you. The other thing I'll mention, multiple interviewers. And this is something that I think happens pretty frequently, at least with CUNY and higher ed settings specifically. Many positions are filled via committee. So, at a minimum, make sure that you follow up with the chair of the committee or the person who scheduled the interview with you and was your main point of contact. And if possible, if you have the ability to do so, refer to the conversation that you had with the other interviewers as well. Again, if it was, a pretty lengthy interview, maybe you were, visiting the employer site for an entire day and you met with several people. This is where, sort of taking notes can come in handy, and really taking the time to follow up with certain people individually if it seems necessary. Clark, anything I'm missing here on follow-up letters?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I agree with everything you said. Again, it's another opportunity for you to demonstrate who you are, how you write, and reiterate. And I do think it's a great opportunity to show that you listened during the interview and that you can recap some of the main points that were made. And that can help, that might reinforce the memory for the person who interviewed you, because they're talking to a lot of people they might have forgotten. And if you remind them, that could be, oh, that's right, that was a good point they made. They have that unique skill or ability.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes it can be helpful for you as a candidate as well, because if you're planning to send a follow-up and a thank you letter, when you come out of the interview, you may be more likely to take some notes and really be able to sort of analyze the position for yourself, because ultimately job interviews and this whole process, they're your decision as much as they are the employer's. And I think that the follow-up process can be helpful to check in with yourself, to think about how the interview went and, how you think the job would go. A couple of notes. I've mentioned a little bit about online applications, applicant tracking systems, particularly, in larger organizations. They may have, a system where you have to create a candidate profile in order to apply for one or multiple positions. The suggestion is to take the time to fill those out completely. If you need to copy and paste from your resume, it's still a good idea to go back through and make sure that the formatting is not completely thrown off, that the phrases are still making sense, that margins are still aligned if possible, different things like that. It's pretty rare, I think, to be asked to fill out a paper application, but if that is the case, you follow sort of the same rules. Fill it out completely, make sure that you're honest and forthcoming. Even if there are certain things that are not on your resume for one reason or another, particularly if there is a gap in your employment, you want to make sure that you fill out as much of that information as you can on applications. And finally, as I mentioned before, use your resume and your references page when you're filling out these online applications. That way you can make sure that you're putting in the correct information, free of typos and errors. Lastly, I mentioned employment applications, and are they legally binding? And this is where, again, being honest is important, because at the end of these applications, even within these applicant tracking systems, they usually have that line where they ask you to attest that you're being honest and that you're providing accurate information. And it's not necessarily that you would legally get into trouble if you're not being honest or accurate, But down the line, if you do get the employment offer and they go back and they check your references and they do the background screen, this is where they're going to look for that information. So it's important that you do take the time, even if it seems tedious, and even if you're submitting your resume as well, it's important to take the time and make sure that your applications are accurate and honest. Okay, at this point, I have concluded the content part of our webinar, and we'll go ahead and move into the Clark Show. At this point, what I'm going to do is I have 2 sample resumes that were submitted. I'm going to show them on the screen, and Clark is going to give us his immediate impressions of the documents. I will clarify that he has not seen these documents. We felt that it would make it more realistic and worthwhile for him to be sort of looking at them on a first glance, much like it would be for an employer when they're first looking at a resume when it's submitted. So bear with us as we take a little bit of time and go through them. I'm going to go bring the first one. All right, so here we
And Shannon,
go.
one thing I just wanted to mention when you were talking about the application.
Oh yeah, please.
The application should obviously be consistent with what you're putting in your resume. It made me think about your LinkedIn profile. Would encourage everyone to have one. And just make sure that your LinkedIn profile and your resume are saying the same things, that there's consistency there.
Yeah, that's very true. It's something, I don't know if I mentioned it today, but it's certainly important because I know that I talked about not including a photo and making sure that all of that stuff is accurate. Many employers, even if they're not necessarily supposed to, they get so curious. So they are possibly going to go to your LinkedIn profile if they look at your resume. So I agree, that's a great point. It is really important to make sure that they mirror one another and that there's accuracy in the data on both of those documents.
And the what's the word I'm looking for? When you have people write a testimonial for you, that's not the right word, but on your LinkedIn profile, that's a great thing too. It's it's to hear what your work colleagues or your prior supervisors have had to say about you.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, so looking at this, first reactions, I feel like this is what I was saying earlier. It's a scannable resume. I feel like it's easy on the eyes. It's laid out nicely. Like I'm not looking at the words yet. I'm just kind of looking at the, kind of at the high level at how it looks. I've got, the experience there, and then I've got the education below. Okay, so right. Oh, so you've got the education here. Got it.
I'm going to see if I can make it a little bit larger. Oh, maybe that's too big. Okay.
Yeah, so we've got the dates, we've got the, Shannon has genericized the name of the organization, but the positions are listed there, where there's some bullets underneath. And if you can go to the next page. And down to the bottom. Okay, great. Yep. So let's go back up to the top and look at some of the words. So we've got the very top. Okay, we've got qualifications. Works well independently, bilingual English, Spanish, excellent with client relations and services, adapting in new environments quickly, proficient in Microsoft Office suite. I think my feedback on that would be Things like the bilingual, the proficiency in Microsoft Office, et cetera, are very specific, and those are great. Things like working well independently and within a team is pretty general, and in my experience, most people say that. And that's probably something you could say in an interview, but I feel like that's something that maybe if you want to include it, maybe put it a little further down on the list. And if bilingual or bilingual English Spanish is important to this particular job, then you might want to have this at the top. But when you think about the types of roles that you're applying for, what are the skills that are most important? Like it says, excellent with client relations and services. If it's a customer service position, then something like that would be relevant. So really thinking about the skills and maybe the technical skills, like in that last bullet about Microsoft Office, that are most important. With the experience, as Shannon said, you want to use present tense verbs, and it looks like that's happening here, so that's great. Organize, that's a good action. Manage, develop, serve as the provide, perform. Those are some really good, strong verbs there. Organize and manage the office, schedule executive meetings and prepare agendas. You've got some specific things in here listed about what's the tasks that are being done. Managing correspondence, preparing reports, compiling spreadsheets, got some really good specifics in here. I think a question would be, when you've got day-to-day operations of 170 employee bureau,
Yeah.
I think numbers and percentages stick out. So if you've got some statistics that you could include, like if you implemented something that saved time, how much time was saved, or did you say, was there a cost savings, anything like that? With the higher education position, monitored, dealt directly with, managed, supervised, coordinated, managed. You've got some good, I think you've got some strong verbs here. You've got budget experience. Again, that might be something you want to put at the top in terms of your qualifications. Is budget, monitoring the budgets, or that type of skill. And again, just thinking about any numbers, statistics you can show in terms of impact that you had, initiative that you took. There's the one here, monitored online student course responses versus EverFi. I'm not familiar with that software. Maybe it's known in the industry, but if it's not, you might want to just say what it is and not use the name.
Yeah.
And then you've got the executive secretary role. Now, I will say, here there's a shift because you want to be consistent. The first, most of these bullets seem to be they don't seem to have start with the verbs like the other ones did. So you want to be consistent there. So maybe as served as main point of contact for the immigration department. Yeah, so just kind of look back so that all of your bullets start with verbs.
Yeah, I'll add here, something that comes up on resumes a lot is this phrase responsible for payment, collection, and documentation, or responsible for management and coordination. Those are somewhat easy to switch up instead of saying responsible for management, you could say managed. That's something that is fairly common on resumes and relatively easy to correct, and really, I think, makes a difference.
Again, quantities, managed all correspondence, is it worthwhile to include how much correspondence, or, the volume of records being processed? I mean, there's some great experience in here. It's training, onboarding other people. There's budget experience. There's a lot of kind of coordination and organizational skills.
Yeah.
There's something about the formatting of the education section that I think could be maybe a little tighter.
Yeah, it might even be that if it could be listed similar to how the job
Yeah.
titles are listed, it might make it stand out. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I kind of, from my own personal rule of thumb, is I typically don't use bullets if there's only one item. So that's just my style. But so yeah, I would just look at that. I mean, well, what's there looks, I mean, you've got your dates and
Yeah.
yeah, you've got your anticipated graduation date. You might even want to, if it's 2022 and the year's almost over, you might want to put the month when you're thinking that's going to happen. Yeah, very nice job.
So I'm going to bring the second one up.
I'm sorry, I'm being a little long-winded, sorry.
You know what, I'm just looking at the time as well. But I would like to, take a couple of minutes at least to look at this one.
Shannon, what's the font size on here? Is this 11?
Yep, looks
Okay.
like 11. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, again, I think this is scannable, it's readable. You've got your education, you've got your experience. The experience is, so it's in reverse chronological order, which is the way you want it. You've got your, under education, you've got the school, you've got your degree, you got the nature of the work that was done. If you could scroll down, Shannon. Experience, you've got the company and how long you've been working there. As freelance IT, okay, that's like as self-employed. I got restaurant work. Okay, positions. Okay, good. So if you go back to the top, I guess the question, I don't typically see education as the starting point, because I think people really want to see what kind of work experience that you have. Your education is obviously very important too. So I guess I would just ask what the strategy was behind putting the education first. So just thinking about that. I would say visually, on this first page particularly, there's a lot of white space on the right side. So there's you might as well use up the space. Maybe it means you have a shorter resume, but that's fine. And hey, we've all, I'm obviously further into my career than many of you, but when I was starting out, I didn't have a lot, to include on there. And everyone's been there, people who are interviewing, when you're right out of school, whether it's high school or college, you have, less experience than someone who's had more years in the workplace. And that's just a reality. And everybody deserves an opportunity. So, yeah, so if the resume is shorter because you have less experience, I think that's totally fine. But I would try to use up the space. And maybe some of those bullets on the first page could be combined, so that there aren't so many. Looking at some of the words: coordinate, set up, install. Now, remember the tip was to use past tense. So if we're looking at that telecom company, we'd want to use past tense verbs there instead of present tense, which would be for a current position. Oh, can you scroll up a second, Shannon? I think so run and install CAT5, 6 or Ethernet, etc. Again, if that's relevant to the position that you're applying for, that kind of specifics would be helpful, that's great. If not, maybe rethink whether to include that or be that specific. Again, we talked about any stats, any numbers, any percentages, any dollar savings. Quantifying is really, I think, really sticks out. And under data services, these are great descriptions, converting files supplied by the customer. And that's a very specific job that was done, working with these different groups for uploading and ordering prints. That shows collaboration with a lot of different people. Yeah, I mean, these are very specific tasks, which I think are great. And again, just thinking about accomplishments that you could list, or any initiative that you took, anything new that you introduced, things you're proud of.
I'll mention something that I'm noticing here that, this is a kind of a catch-all, I think, of some different, like bartending and customer service or retail or food service work, which that experience is extremely valuable in a lot of different ways. And I think maybe it would be useful for this person to describe some of the differences in these types of organizations, or, maybe at this organization, they created the schedule for all of the people who were bartenders. Or maybe at this organization, they were responsible for opening and closing. Those kinds of details can be added to, give a little bit of variety and also provide context to experiences, even if they are, like I said, retail or food service or customer service.
Yeah, I mean, when I was out of school, I had worked for a restaurant for a few years, and I just listed the fact that it was I grew up in Baltimore. I listed the fact that it was like, there was some statistic, it was like the third, highest volume restaurant in the city, something like that to differentiate it. Or, yeah, I completely agree with Shannon. You've got the space here because all of the extra space on the first page. I agree. Give yourself more credit for what you accomplished when you were working at those 3 different places. Those are great skills. I'll tell you that the skills that you learn in summer jobs and restaurant work, retail, so invaluable in terms of customer service, and they can be very high stress environments. And I still have nightmares about waiting on tables. I wasn't very good at it. So
I agree. Okay, so I'm seeing we're at 1:30. I would love to, if Clark is open to it, I would love to maybe take like 5 minutes and see if we can do a couple of the questions that have come in. I do want to thank our participants, and certainly if you need to run, that's completely understandable. We are going to share the slides, the recording, some sample documents and so forth with everyone, so you won't necessarily miss out on too much if you do need to jump. But maybe we'll take about 5 minutes here to go over some of the questions. I was just looking at the chat and I see a couple of questions. Okay, let me see. Oh, here's a good question about the content on the resume and coming up with repeating words. Sometimes it's difficult to completely have different action verbs in every single phrase and bullet. I mean, the question is sort of how much is too much repetition? What do you think, Clark?
I've totally had that challenge myself. How many different words are there for managed or led or, I think so. I think at some point repeating is fine. Maybe within a particular job, maybe you don't want to use the same word more than twice. That might be a guidepost. Use an online thesaurus. I mean, I've done, that's what I've done to try to find different words. But yeah, I wouldn't knock yourself out. Just kind of try to space it out so they're not right next to each other, and mix it up a little bit. That's what I would advise.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's great advice. I'm getting some questions about how do you indicate on a resume? And this is a very, I would say, timely question about when many of us shifted from in-person work to remote and hybrid and so forth. What's a good way to indicate that on the resume?
From what standpoint, in terms of your work location, or
Yeah, I think my advice would be to really add it in with your descriptions and your bullets describing that position. If you shifted in March of 2020 to a fully remote role, maybe indicate that in the description. I also would, in the same breath and suggestions related to that, I also would make sure that if there were new technical skills or new sort of software programs that you started to use when you did shift to remote work, that you make sure you add those to your resume, even if they're not necessarily related to your customary job function. I do think it's important. I know Microsoft Teams was something that I was not familiar with at all prior to the pandemic, and it's something that I use on a daily basis. You could also indicate that in the cover letter, especially if it's important to show your ability to be flexible and adaptable and those kinds of things.
Shannon, I thought you raised a really great point, which is, for any of you on the Zoom today that had to help, a company or your school transition like on the fly from in-person to virtual, if there's some way that you helped with that or facilitated that, I mean, that's a major accomplishment because everybody can relate to that. I mean, people had to scramble in so many cases. And if there's anything, that's an accomplishment that I would include.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And certainly if you're looking for a job and you're focusing on positions that are hybrid or remote, I think it's even more important to make sure that you highlight those kinds of things. I'm seeing some other questions related to e-portfolios and personal websites or GitHub profiles. Those are all very important to add to your resume heading. Sometimes I think, especially if an employer is, reading a whole pile of resumes, sometimes they'll, click on those links, and that's where they'll really get a feel for what you're offering and the qualifications you have. So absolutely suggest adding those to your resume. I also, in the same breath, I know Clark brought up LinkedIn, and I can't believe that I went through the webinar and didn't talk about LinkedIn, but it's also important to add the link to your profile on your resume. And I also suggest including the link to your profile in your email signature, because sometimes if you are sending like a thank you letter from your email, the person might just kind of wander down and click on your LinkedIn profile. And that's another way to help them remember you and stay top of mind. Clark, other thoughts on that?
I think that's a great idea. The portfolio, et cetera, that's a wonderful way to differentiate yourself and show your work products. I think that's so, or if you have a website, that's fantastic.
Agreed. I'm seeing a lot of questions come in with like some different, a lot of real specific questions, and I want to make sure that we're mindful of time. Let me go through and just ask Clark one other thing that I like to, I think would be a good way to conclude our session today. Is there anything that we have not addressed today about resumes or cover letters or other job search related documents that you think we should add?
Someone gave me advice once about, this is kind of in some ways preparing for interviews, but they said, have a few, they called them PAR statements, and it's an acronym. So P is for problem, A is for action, and R is for results. And the idea was, and I used this when I was interviewing, have like 5 of those stories. People love a story. So that you think about, okay, there was a situation at work, that was my problem. And here's what I did, here's my action. And then here were the results of that, and try to quantify it. We came in on, I did it on time, the quality was outstanding, or I saved some money, or I saved time. And then after you've told your story, say, and this is an example of my ability to XYZ. Manage a project effectively, manage a budget, lead a team, whatever it might be. And if you have some of those, I just think they're such confidence builders, because you can memorize your story, add specifics, make it real, make it unique. And I just think having those can really be effective in an interview. And the other thing is, here's one of my things in interviews that I notice. Often people get nervous and they talk too much, and they don't know when to kind of finish their answer. And having those PAR stories, you've got a beginning and an end. So it kind of saves you that way. You can practice, as Shannon was saying, like read your resume out loud, write your PAR statements, read it out loud, time it, try to keep it under, 2 minutes. And that was very helpful advice to me.
I think it's very useful, and I think it is applicable to resumes and communicating your qualifications and skill sets. I think it's important to think about describing those kinds of things in your resume statements or in your summary statement as well. So thank you, Clark. Very useful feedback.
Sure.
At this point, we are 11 minutes past when we were supposed to finish. So I am happy to see that we have a number of our participants still with us today. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Clark, so much. I've learned today, and I'm sure that our attendees have as well. You will receive, as I said before, a recording. You'll receive the slides, some samples of documents, and we'll also ask that you fill out a quick evaluation to let us know your impressions about today's webinar. And once again, thank you to Nikita and our captioner, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.
Great being with you. Thanks, everyone.